Hello and welcome to ISTD or ISTPHD. Thank you all for being here. We're hoping you'll find it to be a lively and informative session. My name is Brenda Dermody and I'm a design practitioner, author and educator, and I'm based at TU Dublin, Ireland, and I'm the Ireland coordinator of the ISTD Student Assessment Scheme, the Deputy Head of Education and a Fellow of ISTD. For any of our attendees who may not know, the ISTD is a professional body run by and for typographers, graphic designers, and educators. The Society has an international membership who share and support its aim to create and inspire interest in all forms of typographic practice. I'd like to offer sincere thanks to Tony Pritchard, Belinda McGee, Brian Palmer, David Coates, and Sabina Muller, who have helped to make this evening happen. And so to tonight's event. In comparison to the sciences, where there are clearly demarcated pathways from undergraduate to postdoctoral research, the discipline of graphic design is relatively under-theorized. There's both need and opportunity to explore the territory of expanded practice in graphic design. If it is the case that the locus of knowledge in visual communication is in the field or in industry, why is it important to bring this knowledge into the academy? What constitutes expanded practice in graphic design, and how does this relate to traditional practices and in turn to other disciplines? What can we learn from researching these complexities? And in short, why is it important for designers to do PhDs, and how might you get started with all of this in the first place? To talk about this, we have three speakers who've all completed practice-based PhDs in graphic design, and I'd now like to introduce them. Dr. Russ Bestley is Reader in Graphic Design and Subcultures at London College of Communication, and he's also the chair of the College Research Degree Subcommittee dealing with PhD management, progression and administration. He's joint PhD coordinator, currently co-managing 60 plus PhD students, plus lead on applications, interviews, and etc. He's PhD Director of Studies, Supervisor, Examiner, and Viva Chair, and most of his student-facing work is at postgraduate level. And we'd also like to thank Russ for suggesting the name of the series of talks, ISTPHD. Prior to studying graphic design, our second speaker, Dr. Gill Brown, worked as a geophysicist for many years. She's now a freelance graphic designer and illustrator specializing in scientific visual communication. In 2019, she was awarded a PhD in graphic design from University of the Arts London, during which she collaborated with the Centre for Neuroimaging Sciences at King's College London to devise a new methodology for the creation of scientific conceptual figures. She continues to work with the CNS and runs workshops at King's and other institutions, covering good graphic design practice and the production of figures. Gill applies her research experience in all of her work and gives presentations to design students about the importance of graphic design practice in research. And our final speaker this evening, Dr. Kate Mclean, works at the intersection of human perceived smellscapes, cartography, and the communication of eye-invisible sensed data. She leads international public smell walks and translates the resulting collected smell data using digital design, watercolor, animation, scent diffusion, and sculpture into smellscape mappings. She completed her PhD, Nose First, Practices of Smell Walking and Smellscape Mapping at the RCA under the guidance of Professor Teal Triggs and external advisor Chris Perkins. She now leads the newly formed BA Graphic Design program at University of Kent and continues her practice-based research into the representation of historical and changing smellscapes and investigates uses of technology to explore and communicate little-known places. Just before I hand over to the speakers, the speaker sessions will take about 40 minutes in total, and we hope to have 20 minutes for questions afterwards. Some of you have already sent in questions, and we'll also take your questions via the chat, and we'll keep an eye on Twitter as well. If you're happy to share this information, please tell us your name and where you are from and what college or university or workplace you might be from, and we can include this with your question so everybody has a sense of where we all are. Joining us for the Q&A will be Justin Burns. He's currently in year 5 of a PhD, and his subject is lettering and typography at the British Seaside, a study of resort identity development and experience. So we're going to start with Russ. Dr. Russ Bestley is going to speak about aspects of the process of applying for and undertaking a PhD in graphic design. And he will also discuss some of his own journey in doing his PhD. So over to you, Russ.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try and share my screen. Oh, I've got this, that's disabled at the moment. Can we make me a host? Okay, that's got it. So hopefully we can see that.
Yep.
Yep. Okay. Thank you, and thank you for the introduction. My name's Russ Bestley. I've been asked to try and keep this informal, which works for me because I tend to do these things on a wing and a prayer. So my name's Russ Bestley. I'm a reader in graphic design and subcultures at London College of Communication, the old LCP in London, University of the Arts London. As per the introduction, most of my work is with PhD students. I supervise PhD students, but I'm also a qualified examiner and a chair of examinations. So I'm kind of heavily involved in the organisation of the PhD process. That started for me around about 20 years ago. I started working at LCP as it was then in the mid-90s, and started teaching postgraduate in the late 90s, MA level, and then I did my own PhD in the early 2000s, which I'm going to come on to a little bit later. But I was asked to talk about the process of the PhD, the process of applying for PhD, keep this informal, and hopefully we can move some of this into the discussion and the questions and answers that are going to follow on a little later. So I said when I was asked to do this, one of my favourite things to do with PhD students is the PhD for Dummies. So that's what I'm going to try and talk you through, a simple approach to understanding the PhD journey. So a lot of this is based on my own experience. As I say, I started teaching in the mid-90s at LCP. And I started co-running the postgraduate graphic design program there in 1999-2000. I started running the MA in graphic design, which then morphed and changed, and we evolved parallel courses. We had an MA in graphic branding and identity, an MA in contemporary typographic design, an MA in graphic moving image, and a PG Cert and a PG Dip that were programs which were for students who went from non-traditional design backgrounds to learn the basics of design. So we were really appealing for mature students who came from the profession, people who came from outside design, wanted to move into design, which I think Gill is probably going to talk a little more about a little later on. And at the same time, I was working with my colleague at the time, Ian Noble, who sadly passed away in 2013, to develop a series of books. This book at the moment, this cover that I'm showing you, is the 4th edition due out next year of a book called Visual Research. This is by myself and Paul McNeil, a typographer from Muir McNeil. The previous editions of the book date back to the early 2000s, up on the top left there, of this book, Visual Research. It's gone through, now in its 4th iteration, over a journey of around about 20 years. What Ian and I tried to do originally with that book was reflect on our practice. There was a changing nature of graphic design in the 1990s. A lot of people were theorising graphic design. A lot of theorists, we felt, were talking about graphic design from outside. And there was a lot of discussion about postmodernism and its impact on design, the idea about the reader and empowering the reader, about meaning being meaningless. And we said, well, how do we understand this stuff? How do we understand theory? How do we engage with it as practitioners? How do we work with our postgraduate students to understand that? So we just started developing this reflective book as a way of thinking about design practice and rethinking our own practice as designers. So we went through that, published that in the early 2000s. As I say, it's gone through 4 iterations. That's kind of the start of my journey to understanding my own practice as a designer. Prior to that, I hadn't really thought about it in that way. So I'm going to give you a quick overview in my PhD for Dummies, which you may or may not agree with. I'm sure some people won't. I'm going to start with the idea that design is research. I think graphic designers are perfectly suited to PhD research, because it's kind of what we do in our profession. It's kind of what we do as a practice. So graphic design here, one of my definitions, is a process that can be used to analyze data, to interrogate, reflect upon, and reveal relationships, patterns, and hierarchies. So we can use design as a tool for finding out. We can also use graphic design as a way to communicate our findings. So we're great. We're in a perfect position as visual communicators to use the tools that we have to find things out, to discover, to analyze, and to communicate what we've discovered and our interpretations and our findings. I think that makes us perfectly suited to this PhD journey, PhD model. So this is where I move on to getting thrown out of the magic circle and joining the Borg. I'll explain these things. Gill's heard this from me before because I was Gill's PhD supervisor. I always, when I did my PhD, I think I struggled through it in the early 2000s because nobody told me what the rules were. They said, well, do a PhD, and I'm going to talk a little more about that in a moment, and find your way through it. And nobody would tell me, well, what is it I'm trying to do? How am I trying to convince people of my contribution to knowledge? How am I going to trying to break new ground? Nobody showed me the path, showed me where the objective was with this. And I've come retrospectively to see it as like being in the magic circle, a magician who gives the secrets of magic away and then gets thrown out of the secret club of the magic circle, that there's this smoke and mirrors that goes with PhD, that we're not supposed to tell people how it works. They're supposed to somehow struggle until they discover it. So I'm an advocate for telling people how it works. Joining the Borg, I'll come back to a little later for Star Trek fans. So a PhD is a research degree that confirms the holder's ability to conduct a high-level research project. So a PhD is a qualification that shows that you can research and you can organize research, you can conduct a research project and reach findings and communicate your findings. So in short, it's not necessarily about you as an individual or the subject, or the process. It's about the set of transferable skills that you gain by undertaking the PhD and that you can demonstrate. Another parallel to graphic design, a good editorial designer can design a book about various subjects. They don't just design one book, they can adapt to a brief. A good researcher can adapt to a research content and a research brief. Novelty or even originality is not in of itself a contribution to knowledge. This is something I find often with speculative proposals from potential PhD students, that the creation of something new may be great, but it isn't necessarily something that counts as research. Again, I'm going to use another bad analogy. It's a bit like running a marathon with one red shoe singing the Macarena. So nobody's done it before. You can get a world record for it, but it doesn't really mean anything unless there's lots of people that want to do the same thing and want to understand why you did it. So it's about that contribution to knowledge, about joining a community, which I'll come back to. Research objectives. So this is when I talk to students about setting up a PhD proposal, consider what you want to find out, who you plan to communicate your findings to, how you're going to go about doing it, where you're going to go to get information, and when each stage of the work will take place. It's the same as setting up a design project, a design brief, a self-initiated design brief. What and why specify the issue or problem that will be addressed. So define your aims and objectives. What am I trying to do? How do I know about? I'm going to be taking steps towards achieving it. State why this is important. So why is it important to you? Why is it important to someone else? Where and who? So what's the context for your research? What's the context for your questions? What other research exists in the same area? Where does it map onto? And what contribution will your project make to advancement of knowledge in that field? So you have to define, well, who else is doing this stuff? Where is the knowledge that already exists? And where does my new knowledge contribute and add to that? How and when? So the research methods, how am I going to go about doing the project? How will I go about addressing questions and addressing issues to solve the problems? Again, it's very much like a design brief, the way I see it. And so what? The so what question, the dreaded question. So it's not just the gathering of data and material and facts and stuff. This is something that I see often in, particularly with undergraduate students and teaching, that research is seen as the gathering of things. I can see a typo on that slide. It's actually the analysis and the filtering of that and the interrogation, what you do with that stuff. So it's from data to information to knowledge. It's that transition that we're interested in, I think, as researchers, not just the gathering. And joining the community, back to the Borg. So anybody who's a Star Trek fan, the Borg is a collective that assimilate people into their collective group. So the purpose of a PhD, the contribution to knowledge, you have to demonstrate that you understand the field, you understand what research exists in a field. So therefore, that's the literature review. You can demonstrate I've read widely, I've understood who else is working in this context. I've identified something new that I want to say. And then when you come to the PhD Viva, you're examined by peers, by people who are experts in that field, who welcome you into that club. They say, yes, you brought something new to us. I think it took me a long time, and maybe I'm unusual in this instance, it took me a long time to realize after my PhD that I wasn't on a solo journey. that I was joining a community and I was part of a community. And it was a collective body of knowledge. It wasn't an individual pursuit and an individual body of knowledge. That took me a long time to realize that, and I think it's really important. So my own research work, I was asked to talk briefly about that. My PhD was about punk graphics in the UK. It was about punk record sleeves. And twofold. It was how did different subgenres, different branches of the punk movement in the UK between 1976 and 84 establish different visual identities, and how did it map regionally? So there were small punk bands springing up all over the country that produced their own identities, often by taking a photograph of a local landmark with themselves abusing it or singing about the local council. So I was interested in this regionalism. That led ultimately to a book called The Art of Punk. There's some covers of different editions of that. My joining the Punk Scholars Network as a founder member, we've now got several thousand members worldwide of the Punk Scholars Network, mostly musicologists, ethnographers, social scientists. I'm one of the few designers in this group. I'm a lead editor on a journal called Punk and Post-Punk, which takes contributions from a whole range of fields. Again, I lead on the art and design input on that, but I'm the editor of the journal in full. My PhD looked at this kind of stuff, these kind of record sleeves, and tried to map them, tried to understand how they worked, where they were located, what design methods were used, what design practices were used, whether they were professionally designed or designed by amateurs, and the evolution of graphic style and typographic style in relation to this pop movement, this popular cultural movement. So that led to a whole range of outputs. This was an exhibition at the Design Museum just before it closed down at Shad Thames. So this was on the Thames, where I organised these things in typologies. There were timelines which mapped a chronology and a geography of where these bands came from, when these records were released. And there was an interactive version of this that you could pull out certain regions or certain bands or certain labels or certain designers to show the evolution of styles over a period of time, over 8 years. So that's some examples from there. And ultimately I end up I do talks about punk and graphic design. This was from the Typo Circle talk. I design books. So these are some books that I'm involved in. I write some and I design some of these books, which encapsulate different aspects about punk over the last 40 years, punk pedagogies, punk and teaching. I wrote a chapter in there about the relationship between punk and graphic design education. And these are recent books. There's 2 books that are just coming out this month about punk around the world, in a series of books called Global Punk, that I'm a lead editor and designer on those books. So that's me.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Russ. Some really useful insights into the PhD process and getting started, and actually positioning yourself as part of a community or collective in what's seen sometimes as a really solitary pursuit. So if anybody has questions for Russ, it'd be great if you'd put them into the chat. Thanks, Russ. So now we have Gill Brown, who's going to speak to us about her journey from the sciences into graphic design research and then back again. Gill,
thanks very much, Brenda. I'll just share, hopefully just a PowerPoint. So hopefully that's popped up. Yeah.
Perfect.
Great. So yeah, as Brenda said, yes, I used to be a scientist. I originally got a degree in geology and spent many years working as a geophysicist, but I always had an interest in art and design. So I took some time out to do a foundation course at Chelsea College of Art and absolutely loved it. Stayed on to do a BA in graphic design, but still working part-time as a geophysicist. And after a few more years, I did a part-time MA in graphic design at LCC, still working as a geophysicist to earn some money. And it was at the end of my MA that I started concentrating on scientific visual communication in particular, and that was where my interest lay. I didn't really want to become a commercial graphic designer. I was more interested in its relation to science. And it was one of my MA tutors who suggested that I should do a PhD. And at the time, I didn't even know you could do a PhD in graphic design. Like Russ said, it's the sciences, or Brenda said the sciences, yes, PhDs, but design, really? I wasn't sure. But I spoke to Russ at LCC and I ended up doing a full-time PhD there. I was very lucky. I got funding from UAL, which meant I could finally stop being a geophysicist. because I probably had enough by then. Did full-time research of 3 years and spent 1 year writing up. So in total, it was a 4-year process to get my PhD. And I started with the world's vaguest research question. Really, it's just science and why it looks like that. And I was pretty convinced I would do a theoretical PhD because I didn't have a practice. You know, I wasn't a practicing graphic designer. I didn't have the confidence in my own graphic design abilities to take on a practice-based PhD. That sounded really quite daunting. And at the end of 4 years, of course, I had a practice-based PhD, despite myself, and it was focused on a very specific area of scientific visual communication, that between scientific peer groups when they're exchanging their ideas, processes, theories, using these conceptual figures. So that was where my focus was. So how did I get from that start to that finish in, well, 3 years of research? Well, I started doing, I think, what everyone does, which is some very broad, what Russ called gathering of stuff. So I gathered about 1 million scientific images from the earth and life sciences. But as Russ also said, there comes a time when you have to stop gathering and you have to start doing something. And as a graphic designer, what I started to do was I started to draw the figures. So I would pick the figures myself, I would redraw them in Illustrator or InDesign, and I would take them apart and try and understand the visual languages that make up these figures in these different fields of science. And I also asked scientists to give me figures from their fields that they worked in, rather than me choosing figures that I liked. And one of the figures I was given was from a neuroscientist. It looks like this. And it's very typical of a conceptual figure from neuroscience. And she very kindly explained all the science to me. It took her an hour and a half, so I'm going to spare you that. But what I did do was I drew the figure for myself so that I could start to extract bits from them and start to understand what these shapes might actually mean. So this shape in particular represents a process in neuroscience called chemical neurotransmission, which is a transmission of messages along nerve cells using chemicals. And this little shape here shows the transmission of chemicals from the end of one nerve cell to the start of the next across the synapse between the two, the gap between the two. And there are a lot of figures in neuroscience which have this shape, and I started collecting them. A bit like Russ collected punk records, I collected neuroscience figures and started redrawing them, extracting the shapes that represented chemical neurotransmission. The colors don't mean anything, so if you get rid of the colors and just concentrate on the shapes, then you start to see the relationships that what makes all of these shapes, even though they're all slightly different, to a neuroscientist, they all say chemical neurotransmission. And within the science of neuroscience, there are lots of other elements that mean certain things. So you start to identify them, like all of these shapes are neurons, nerve cells. So a neuroscientist sees this, they immediately think, okay, this figure is about neurons, about nerve cells. And there are elements that even non-scientists will understand, like human brains, for example. I'm sure we all recognize these, but they all tend to be presented in a certain way, a certain orientation, with certain parts of the anatomy always highlighted so that they're instantly recognizable. And these elements all go to make up this visual language. And by actually drawing them and extracting them from the figures, isolating them, comparing them, contrasting them, I could start to understand this visual language for myself, which meant as a graphic designer, I could actually make sense of it and actually start working with these figures. And it's through using the graphic design to understand the figures myself that I started to derive a methodology for the visual analysis of scientific conceptual figures, whereby anyone else, by going through this visual analysis, will be able for themselves to understand the science, to understand the visual language, and also understand the context in which that figure has been created. And this is one of these contributions to knowledge that Russ was talking about. This is one of my contributions to knowledge, was this methodological framework for the visual analysis of scientific conceptual figures that would allow a non-scientist to actually understand them. And graphic design forms a significant part of the analysis, and also I use it to present the results of the analysis as well. So it really is totally wrapped up in the practice. And at this point, I was about halfway through my PhD, probably about 18 months in, when I sort of realized that this was something I could pull together and use in my PhD as a significant part of what I'd achieved. But I also, at about the same time, by coincidence, was offered the chance to collaborate with some neuroscientists at King's College London in the Centre for Neuroimaging Sciences. They were looking for a graphic designer to work with because they wanted an easier way to produce visually consistent conceptual figures for their department. So I thought, great, this is a chance for me to kind of put into practice my theoretical visual analysis framework that I come up with. You know, would it work? Would it allow me to understand the science enough that I could actually help these scientists directly, you know, even though I knew nothing about neuroscience going into this? So 3 of them very kindly offered to be my guinea pigs, if you like, and they were all going to work on figures for upcoming journal articles, and so I was allowed to work alongside with them. So the first thing I had to do was learn their visual language and also learn it so I could draw it for myself, not just redraw someone else's figure, but actually start creating figures for these guys. So I started with the easiest elements, the ones I could understand. So they were the anatomical ones. So he was drawing an anatomical brain, and I used Adobe Illustrator software to do the drawings. And I just naturally broke it up into layers when I was drawing it, just to make it easier for me to keep on top of all the details. But by doing that, I realized that from my one Illustrator file, I could export a range of different brains, from very simple outline brains through to something that's really quite complex. And when one of my neuroscientists saw this, he got very excited and immediately stole these images off me so he could use them in the PowerPoint presentation, because he said it was the first time he'd had the luxury, and he used the word luxury, to have consistent images that were showing different aspects of the same element, in this case, a brain. So I thought, right, this is what I need to do. I need to be able to give scientists a figure that they can adapt and edit themselves to get a range of images of the same element, put in different, showing different aspects of that same element. So how was I going to do that? So I'm thinking back to my 1 million images, which I knew would come in handy after I collected them. And amongst them were these pictures of anatomical models, which scientists use when they're teaching others or learning things, and they can take them apart and look at the anatomy. So I thought, well, perhaps I can do something similar if I take one of these models as an example and redraw it in Illustrator, but using the layers to help me build up the different parts of the model, which can then be either altered, taken out, different layers added in to add more complexity. You could add annotation, you could add text. And by doing that, you can, from this one file, you can export a whole range of different images that scientists could use in presentations, papers, whatever it is that they need to create their figures for. And what you can do for heads, you can also do for bodies, obviously. And as it turned out, pretty much every scientific figure that I needed to draw or help the neuroscientists draw, I could produce in a similar way with these layers, including the more conceptual figures. So this is showing dopamine synthesis pathways in the brain. Hopefully you recognize these little shapes here that appear as being the chemical neurotransmission shapes again, just on their side. And this figure or this image really became one of the most important images in my entire PhD. It's not going to win any prizes for graphic design or typography, but that really wasn't the point of my research. This figure was actually created by one of my neuroscientists who I was working with. I did draw the initial little elements for her, and I showed how to use Illustrator, and then I left her to it. And this is what she came up with after she'd done some editing and arranging. And she told me that just going through the process, through the graphic design practice, so deciding what was going to go on what layer, in what order, how she would color code those layers, made her think differently about the design, the science that she was communicating. So not just in how she would visually represent it, but also in how she would explain it verbally, or how she would write about it, and really how she was thinking about these processes. So by taking graphic design practice and putting it into what is the practice of scientific research, it made her think differently about her science and about her research. So that was kind of like ta-da moment at the end of my PhD, which was a good way to wrap it up in a lot of ways, and helped show that I could actually take graphic design practice, take my methodologies and apply them in a different field and actually make a difference within that field. So coming to the end of my 4 years, so 4 things I learned from doing my design PhD, but it might be useful to know before you go in, I guess. First thing is definitely keep an open mind, because your research will almost certainly change as you go through. I mean, I ended up somewhere completely different than I thought I would when I started. So don't think you have to have absolutely every single thing mapped out, because if you do, it almost certainly will change at some point. Something will crop up, something will happen for good or bad, and you'll have to change. So, so don't worry about that. Keep an open mind and see some opportunities if they do come along. And don't underestimate the importance of practice. Even in a theoretical PhD, as Russ was saying, as graphic designers, we have a huge advantage in being able to organize and visualize lots and lots of information and make sense of it, and use graphic design to help us analyze things and to help us perform research. So I think it's a huge advantage compared to other researchers who can just read and write. We can actually visualize things. And I found that unbelievably helpful in my research, and that's what got me into the practice, definitely. Your supervisory team is very important. So I'm not just saying that because Russ is here and he was one of my supervisors, as was Paul McNeil, who Russ mentioned earlier, but I had a really supportive team. And it's very important you have a supervisor or supervisors who know the PhD process, who can help you get through that process. As Russ said, it used to be you were just thrown in there, I guess, and sink or swim, but now you really need a supervisor who can take you through it, the steps, because there are certain steps you need to go through, and they can be quite up and down, and you just need a team there to get you through. They're not there to do the research for you. You're the research expert in your field, but they are the PhD experts. They're the people who know the process and will get you through it. So that's really helpful. I was a PhD student rep for a year or two. So I did speak to students who didn't have such good experiences with supervisors. So I know how important that was to have someone to help you through the process. And finally, a PhD can be just a starting point. And that's something Russ said to me in our very first meeting, I remember, and I didn't believe him because it seems such a huge deal, PhD. You think, well, once I finish, that's it, put it on the shelf, call myself doctor, job done. But in fact, it was quite the opposite. And since my PhD, you know, it's changed the whole direction of my career. So I still work with the CNS, but we've expanded the scope of what we do. It's not just peer-to-peer communication now. We do also communication with the public and with patients. And everything I did, including the PhD work with them, is on the website, neuroscience-graphicdesign.com, which we're still maintaining and still documenting on there. I run graphic design workshops to try and improve graphic design practice of scientists. I mean, they're not the best graphic designers, that's not what they're there for, but I try and help them a little bit to make their communication more effective. And I also teach them and show them how to make these editable and adaptable figures in Illustrator, which they really enjoy doing. And I work with individual scientists as well to help them create conceptual figures. But the most important thing is that all these working methods, everything I do has come directly from my PhD research. You know, without that, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now. So it really has been a bit of a life changer in terms of my career, definitely. I think that was all I wanted to say. So thank you. I'll hand back to Brenda.
That's super. Thank you so much, Jill. Really great to see how doing a PhD can so positively influence your career and open up a whole new area of practice that influences another field. Really interesting. So finally, I would like, just to also to say questions coming in, if people wouldn't mind mentioning who their name or where they're from, we'll mention that as we go. And so finally, I'd like to introduce Kate Mclean, who's going to speak to us about her PhD journey and how she was asked to stop writing and to draw her proposition.
Thank you. Can I just check, first of all, that you can all see that and you can see it advancing?
No, we can't see it at the moment. Yeah.
Okay, just 1 second then. Let's do that and we'll go through to a window and share from there.
Looks like it. There you go. Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much, Brenda. And it's actually really interesting just listening to the other presenters, because I really do wish that I'd talked to Russ before I started. That confusion about what the hell it is that you're actually trying to do and how you might go about it. I think I was sorely intimidated by the idea that I was actually going to have to write anything. So for me, it's sort of like the idea about trying to put something coherently together as words was something I struggled with. And I'll come back to this sketch here, but this basically is my PhD. And this sketch occurred about halfway through it when I changed supervisors, and the changing supervisor said, Kate, I haven't got a clue what you're talking about or what you're trying to do. Please, can you just draw it and then explain it through drawing it? And I'm not an illustrator and I don't hand draw stuff, but I'd done all this work and I couldn't figure it out. And this whole process, just sort of like drawing it as a sort of a snail that came out of sort of like, well, what's it about? Where does it sit? How does it all work? Was the one thing that actually enabled me to move forwards and to get on with it. Before I started, one of my old teachers from the old head of a college that I studied in the States said, most people hate their PhD by the time they're finished with it. It's an arduous process and you really sort of like, you need to actually love what you're doing in order to be able to go through it and not really hate that academic process at the end. And I don't think I ever found that. And I think that's because I've got something here that I loved, and I haven't always been a graphic designer. I've had many different careers. My first degree came from Chichester in 1988. I've had basically 35 years of doing higher education in various forms. And I think that's had a sort of like a very, very big impact on sort of like how I approached it. The project itself was something that I came across and developed when I was doing an MFA in Edinburgh. And I was fascinated with one thing at the time, which was maps and cartography. I was also really intrigued by the idea that in Edinburgh, I traveled around the world a lot. I was in a new place, and I was trying to do something that lent a tangibility back into design. I was seeing a lot of digital design and I didn't like it. And I wanted to get back to something more sensory. And I started with the tactile. And after about a year, I accidentally moved into smell. And it was that idea about, well, could you actually represent a smellscape visually, that started me on this process. And I mean, I always joke with my students that like graphic design is great if you've got a short attention span, because you get to do lots of different projects for lots of different people, and it's always sort of like really interesting, and you get to find out new stuff all the way along. This one has actually got sort of like the stickiness factor, and has really sort of like just kept me enthused about it constantly, because there are basically so many places in the world that all smell very different, and that changes on an ongoing basis. The downside of starting a PhD with this was that I suddenly found myself inside almost too many different disciplines. I was intrigued by the idea of interdisciplinarity. I don't think I really understood what it meant and what cross-disciplinarity meant at the time. And I was sort of like, I was looking at neuroscience, I was looking at philosophy, I was looking at urban studies, I was looking at sensory studies. People kept saying, Proust, it's all about memory, isn't it? And I had to sort of like fight back and say, okay, so where is my disciplinary field? What is it about? So this process of drawing it meant that I actually eliminated things that, whilst interesting, weren't actually a part of the PhD. And I don't think, I kind of knew vaguely what my contribution to knowledge might be, which is how can you actually represent something that can't be seen? I think I sort of like, I wrote that very early in the proposal, but the actual specifics of it didn't actually emerge really right until the end, when I'd sort of like written up. It was an interesting idea about the sort of like the funding trip. So as I said, I started this in Edinburgh when I was doing an MFA. And from that, I met somebody at a conference who said, I need to introduce you to somebody who would really enjoy supervising you to do this for a PhD. And I hadn't even thought about a PhD. And that guy was Chris Perkins, who was a reader in human geography, cartography at Manchester University. And he was constantly the rock all the way through this process. He helped me craft a proposal that was incredible. It took us a year to get it together. We put it in for ESRC funding, and it got rejected because my initial degree was so crap that nobody thought I should be able to do a PhD in the first place. So I couldn't afford to self-fund it. So I got a job at Canterbury Christ Church University. They said they wanted everybody to have PhDs if they were lecturing there. I went, yes, thank you very much. I said, I'd like to do it at the Royal College of Art. And they said, no, you have to do it here. You have to apply here. And if you can apply here and you get a place, then that's great. So I applied, I got a place, but we couldn't agree who would be able to actually supervise it, because nobody knew any more about any side of it than I did. And I said, look, the only place that I can actually do this is the Royal College of Art. And in the end, they turned around and said, you know what, we'll fund it. And if you, when you complete, you owe us a year of your life, and you can't move institutions after that year. I class myself as incredibly lucky on that process, because after that, they stopped doing any external funding of PhDs. So I got it as a result of being employed in another HEI, and they enabled me to go elsewhere. it's always a tough call about supervisors in institutions, and I think that I say that people matter just a little bit more than place. Chris, the guy on the left sniffing the dead seagull, is that sums up what he would do for my PhD. When I was interested in smell, and he said, right, we need to go out, we need to actually understand what it means to engage with that. How are people approaching it? What will they actually do? Where does disgust come? How does everything fit together? He would do that. And I changed supervisors halfway through from the Royal College of Art, and ended up with Teal. Now, both Teal and Chris know the supervisory process and know the PhD process and had taken candidates through previously. And that, as Gill said earlier, makes all the difference in the world. What I did was up to me. How I could approach it and how they could help me through that process to be able to collate what I got was what their massive contribution to this project was. The RCA also, at the time, were happy to entertain the idea of external supervisors, and I understand from Teal recently that they're no longer doing that. So there was a point where I thought I might have to move out from the Royal College of Art, and I could not find another institution where I thought I would be happy doing this PhD. It belonged there, I belonged there. My approach during the PhD, I did it part-time and whilst working full-time. And I really did a sort of like a Karita Kent, come and go to everything. I embraced that whole scenario. It was scary. I was about 50 years older than everybody else doing a PhD there. But it was still just sort of like enlightening, and it was good fun, and it was constantly stimulating. And I just say that if you get to do one, then do something all the time. Every opportunity that comes your way, take it. If you go to a conference, attend them, see how it works out, present papers. I hate presenting papers, I hate writing papers, but it makes you a better PhD candidate. Book chapters, I got invited to write book chapters. That's like, I don't know how to write. And it's like, okay, you do now because you've got a deadline. I'm a graphic designer, I can work to a deadline. That functions. Exhibitions, that's much more fun. I can make stuff, I can exhibit it. That's superb. Then I can work with other people, start to understand how these things can be curated. I did judging for Malofijej in Pamplona. I did field trips. I was asked to participate in them, present, look at different ways of sort of like conducting different methodologies. And my biggest thing would be to say, please do some ethics early, especially if you're going to be working with people, because I got quite caught up in the fact that I went off and did a whole load of really good stuff. And then it was like, no, you can't use that, Kate, you didn't get ethics approval for it. So you need to start again. I also had an antidote, and I set myself the goal of basically running a marathon for every year that I did the PhD. So basically what that meant was I had time that I could not sit at a computer or try and do something else. And that became, the training time became my thinking time. And it's a bit like having a dream. You go off for a run, you think about what you think of 50 million things, and they manifest as a single sentence, but those sentences really sort of like came into being as well. One of the massive assets, there's some assets in that you should never sort of like get rid of for doing a PhD. One of them is a citation tool. I use Zotero. Somebody, I think Chris, my supervisor, introduced me to it at our first meeting. And it was everything that I read, I thought, oh, I'll remember this, and you don't. And so having this for images and having it for referencing right at the end still is my absolute savior. It's my go-to for saying, okay, here's all the different aspects of smell. After I did this, I then created different folders for each of the chapters of the PhD, so that I could start to organize things and know what I was referring to at any given time. The notes aspect of this means that you can then search on it to say, well, okay, what was that person saying? So you're not just keeping the reference, you're actually keeping you're thinking about it as well. The fellow PhDs were a constant source of inspiration and support throughout this process. When you try to explain something to somebody else, it's sometimes easier than explaining it to yourself. And I actually found the Twitter sphere really interesting and really useful for doing this work as well. And I got to know an awful lot of people through that I then sort of like went off and collaborated with on different aspects of this. And they contributed massively to the project. What I think I got out of it was that I now value immensely the idea about writing and visualizing and creating as a sort of like symbiotic, simulated, sort of like simultaneous equation. My work has become richer as a result of doing the theory and projects that I work on now. I know they're a project when I'm just trying to visualize something and when I've got an idea about it, but I know that it actually becomes research when I've looked at the theory underpinning it and I start to revise based on what I'm doing with that. I think that's probably one of the most valuable things that I've got, and it's made my work better. It's also made it more interesting, and I really like that part of it. Some people at the end of it choose to get a proofreader. I thought I would, and then I found out that apparently for somebody who claims not to be able to write, I can write quite well. But I did get somebody to, I got a proofreader to do it. I didn't use an editor. And just breaking it down and using my graphic design skills to actually say, okay, what does it look like, was kind of really important as well at this point. Working it around work is interesting. Work was the central part. I had one day a week where I could go off and do research. So I claimed that day for 6 years. I did 5 years of research and then 1 year of writing up. But I also did it mornings, evenings, weekends, holidays. I never resented a single second of it. It was fascinating. I loved it. It was mine, and I just wanted to carry on doing it. My original contribution to knowledge came really at the very end when I realised that some of it was practice-led, some of it was practice-based. Even unpacking those terms could take another whole session of this. And basically what my contribution was to actually find a series of ways, in a way quite similar to Gill, but looking at how you might develop ways to represent smellscapes depending on what type of analysis you were doing on those. The Viva was a scary bit at the end. What I did with it was I put it into an exhibition. So instead of just sitting in a room and talking to people, I actually curated an exhibition of the work. I showed them around it, and that became my presentation. So I was using again the skills that I had and the practice that I've been through before in setting up exhibitions, talking to people about my work, in order to make that Viva process not as intimidating as it might have been. And then this is a drawing that I came across very early in the process, and I love it. And it's just imagining sort of like where you are through all this process. So the circle contains human knowledge, you know, a little by the time you've finished elementary school, a bit more by high school. Your master's degree, you start to get a specialty. You read other people's research, it takes you to the edge of that knowledge, and then you focus and you push and you push and you push. And right at the end, you've got your PhD, and all of a sudden the world looks very different. But the important thing to do is to step back and to actually have fun doing it. And oh God, I think, oh, I know what I haven't got. I had another slide in there, which is a really nice one, which is me going, I got a PhD with this.
You can do it now.
But I think that's it from me.
Oh, thank you so much. That was excellent, Kate. And you gave some really sound advice on externalizing and disseminating your research as part of the process and as part of honing your own ideas about what you were doing and your contribution. And also interesting to hear about the possibility of funding, you know, which is, I suppose, a big question for lots of people because it's such a long-term undertaking. Great. So I guess what we can do is, if everybody's happy we can move to some of the questions that have come in over the course of the evening. Yeah. So we have our first question up is actually for Russ, and it's come from Simon in Surrey, and he asks, was your passion for punk music a benefit when doing your PhD, or do you think it would be easier if you chose something that you are more unfamiliar with and can grow to love? How can you choose a subject that will keep you engaged throughout a PhD? Is it even possible?
Good question. I think there's another question that this kind of relates to where we talked about that Kate and Gill mentioned about their background coming into education. I was a non-traditional route into education. I was driving a forklift truck in the late 80s and got made redundant and went to art college with a bunch of 16-year-old kids, and I was in my mid-30s. It was very strange, and I kind of accelerated through to PhD. I think I started studying graphic design as an undergrad in the 90s, early 90s, and started understanding a bit more about visual language, visual communication. And I'd been a punk fan since I was a teenager and collecting this stuff. And I could go back and look at it and say, oh, look, this is the way it works. I can try and analyze it, this ephemera, this graphic packaging. I could try and interrogate it in a different way. So yes, I think that passion for the music and for the scene was important to me to carry me through. I think in some ways it's a love-hate relationship because it kills it for you. It's a bit like I used to be a roadie at one stage, and once you realise how it all works, and there's people roadies dressing up as monsters and running around the stage, and it's not real, then it takes some of the magic away. And I think in some ways you start to understand it better, but it opens up so many new doors and new avenues that to me, yes, the passion continued because I started meeting professional designers who'd worked in that I'd admired their work, and now suddenly I'm friends with people who I'd been buying their records that they'd made, they packaged in 30 years ago, 40 years ago. I met musicologists, historians, a whole range of people in other fields that kind of shared my passion from a different direction. And I think it opens so many doors. There's so much more to discover in the world that I think that's where I think the hub of the punk music was still there, but it just opened up so many different ways to see it.
Great, thank you. We have another question. Wayne in Cape Town, South Africa, kind of in a slightly similar vein, he asks, how vital is it to have a supervisor that has a keen interest in one's research area, like design, typography, etc. I find over here that you may end up with a supervisor who offers only the guidance in academic process, the PhD do's and don'ts. And he has a part 2, which is it a requirement to have an exhibition at the end of one's design PhD? So I don't know who would like to field that.
Sorry, I was just going to say, just to answer part 2 first, I didn't have an exhibition at the end of my design PhD. In my Viva, I sat there and spoke to people and got asked lots of questions, like a very traditional kind of Viva. So no, it's not a requirement. So certainly not at the UAL anyway. So
I actually try and dissuade people. A lot of art practitioners apply to our institution who want to end up with an exhibition, and I try and dissuade them from doing an exhibition as an outcome for a PhD. Produce a body of work, and by all means create an exhibition after the PhD. Kate might disagree with me on this, but forming an exhibition, and then you get all those problems about curatorial practice, about footfall, about location, all of those things that kind of get wrapped into it that are sort of potentially unnecessary for the actual work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be problematic. I got a room at the RCA and I said, look, I want to use this one room. So I set up an exhibition for basically a 24-hour period that was just for the Viva, then took it down again, then had it in another larger exhibition space afterwards. So I wasn't worried about it for the actual PhD itself. I just found that having created that much practice and having a whole load of stuff that wasn't even in the written PhD, I wanted the examiners to see how I saw it flowing and how I saw that movement, not in a traditional book format.
I think that ties in with one of the points that you made, Kate, that I wish I'd made about externalizing the work during the journey. It's something that I encourage students. Gill was publishing papers during the PhD and saying, well, what have I got to do this for? And it's a distraction from the PhD, but it actually forms a very strong part of it. When it comes to examination in particular, I always think that in my PhD for Dummies, I always think it's a great cheat that when your peers, the experts, come to the Viva, if you've already engaged with their peers and demonstrated a contribution to knowledge through peer-reviewed papers or book chapters, then they can't fail you. Because you've already crossed that bridge. So I think it's a great way of bypassing the Viva, of getting that work out there and engaging with the people that they look up to.
It's interesting because in the US, quite a lot of the time, you do training to do a PhD, before you actually start your original research yourself. And you don't normally have the job working in an HEI before you've got the PhD.
Yeah.
And a number of sort of like colleagues in the States said, sort of, how come you're actually publishing stuff? You shouldn't be publishing yet. It's not the right order to do things in. It's like, it's not the right order. I don't think there is a right order for doing it. You do it as you actually need to do it. And I value being pushed to do that.
Well, obviously I lead edit a journal, and we're constantly publishing new material from postgraduate students in particular, and new researchers. And it's a great vehicle for people to facilitate that kind of contribution for them. The other question about the supervisors, one of my supervisors was a photography historian. One of my supervisors was a specialist in Edwardian and Victorian staircases and Wedgwood pottery. And for anybody who understands British TV from the 70s, he described me as the Arthur Negus of punk rock. But Arthur Negus used to be a presenter on the Antiques Roadshow, which would talk about the value of pottery from the 18th century. But he said, well, you're using methods, you're using tools that are sort of that he would use to analyze objects, designed objects. But I happened to be looking at graphic ephemera. And so I didn't have to have a punk specialist. I did have one. I had Roger Sabin, who's a historian who had a lot of understanding of punk, but I had a team of 4 people. I was extremely lucky. But they were very diverse, and actually they all brought something very different to the table. You're never going to get a supervisor who's a complete expert in your PhD, because otherwise there'd be no point in you doing the PhD. You're the expert. You're the person that's developing the expertise. The supervisors are there to try and run alongside it. Gill, when I supervised Gill, I knew nothing about neuroscience. I didn't know what neuroscience was. Still don't, Gill.
I know, despite all my best efforts. I know, I was just going to add to that. I mean, we had long discussions. I remember, did I need to get a scientist on the supervisory team? Did we need to go externally and find someone? We just couldn't really find anyone suitable. And so in the end, because I had a science background and because I ended up working with a lot of scientists and getting direct input from them, we managed fine. And I find it much more valuable to have supervisors who knew about the design side, which I didn't feel as confident about in some ways, having come purely from a science background, and to get me through the PhD process, because I also found that, I found that quite difficult on the theoretical side, how to write about this, I was good at producing all the graphic design, I was good at talking about the science, but how did that fit into the world of visual studies and that kind of thing? That was where I was struggling, and that's where my supervisors really, really helped. So I think Russ is right. You don't need someone who knows exactly about your research area, because that's your job. But you do need someone who knows about PhDs, knows about visual research, knows about research, and how you bring it all together. As Kate was saying, how you come up with something that's a coherent body of work at the end of it that you can present as your thesis.
Many models of PhD also allow for, you have a supervisory team, normally of two supervisors, sometimes 3. As I say, I was extremely lucky to have 4. But you can also have external advisors who are kind of unpaid advisors, consultants that you can work with on particular aspects of the work. So it might be that that Gill's were the neuroscientists that you were working with at King's. There might be people who are working in a particular field that you can consult and bounce ideas against.
Yeah, we've had a question in from Mohammed in South Africa. He has asked, is the institution you do your PhD through important? And I guess that ties in with the whole area of, is it the supervisor or is it the institution that you would rank as being more important? I don't know if any of you would like to comment on that.
I think the institution is important in terms of if they're used to dealing with the type of work that you want to do. So to go to somewhere that didn't do practice-based would, for me, have been incredibly difficult. And I looked at it with the University of Manchester. It would have been a very different PhD that I'd done if I'd been there, and it had been far more theoretical. The RCA was the right place. I realised that. And thankfully, I didn't get the funding to go to Manchester in the first place. But I do think they need to understand what practice is, if that's an important part of your PhD, in order to be able to help you navigate how to work through that. So their expertise from sort of like even an ethics standpoint and everything else get them, you need that expertise in order that they can understand and help you go through it.
So you need to really research both institution and supervisors and make sure that it's a good fit. We have a question in from Tony Pritchard, who has asked, he's in UK, can the speakers talk us through their educational journey to the PhD? For example, do you need an MA before you embark on a PhD?
I think that MA is valuable. I think an MA in traditional MAs, are really focused. I mean, I like Kate's diagram at the end of her presentation. Traditionally, an undergraduate will give you the core skills, academic skills, and the kind of practical tools, and then an MA will really focus on research methods and methodology. Traditionally, I think they're a little more erratic now. I think there's good MAs and not so good MAs, quite honestly, from the kind of quality of applications that I see for PhD. And the PhD really digs in on that idea about methodology and method. I have to say, I came from a very non-traditional route, as I said, and I didn't do an MA either. I went from BA into senior lecturer into PhD within 3 years.
You spoke, Russ, at one point in our conversations about it takes about a year. I think Kate might have said the same. It takes about a year to prep a proposal.
Yeah, I think
register. Is that right?
UAL, we encourage potential applicants to do some searching, check some links, check out the bios of staff research on the website, find out the kind of people that might be interested in what you're interested in understanding and interested in doing. Contact them. I get people contacting me regularly, and I'm happy to volunteer my time to support them, to help guide them and shape a proposal, which can take up to a year prior to applying. So it's a really good practice to do that. It does depend on the generosity of staff and the time of staff to be able to do that. And then we end up kicking ourselves when you spend so much time working with a student and then they disappear to the Royal College instead, or wherever it might be. But it is one of those parts of the job for senior researchers that we undertake.
Okay.
Oh, can I just say, sorry, just to chip in on the MA front, because I did do an MA, and I did the MA at LCC, so at UAL, the same institution where I did the PhD. And I found it really useful to introduce me to how to research, definitely, because you don't really do too much of that in a BA. Yeah. And also to introduce me to a lot of terminology, like methods and methodologies and all these kind of terms, which are quite difficult to get your head around, and you don't really tackle in an undergraduate degree. I think if I'd gone straight from an undergraduate degree I couldn't have gone straight into a PhD, not with my background, I don't think. So doing the MA was really helpful, sort of halfway, as a step along that process. And at the time I didn't know I was going to do a PhD. I just wanted to do an MA myself out of my own interest to get back into graphic design, but it was a perfect preparation for me, I think, to go into the PhD.
Great.
So
we've questions flying in now. We have a question from Gill in Belfast. Any advice regarding sustaining a research focus when undertaking a PhD part-time? So I guess that's part-time versus full-time.
It's just called love it. It's when it is something that you are still intrigued by and you're curious about, and it keeps throwing up new things at you, and you keep that open mind that Russ mentioned right at the start. Is you have to have that, or you need to have that endless curiosity about what it is that you're doing. And with the sort of like externalizing, saying yes, going off doing things, you'll meet new people, they'll give you new ideas. If you try and do it, quite often people say a PhD is a lonely route, and I think if you try and do it lonely, then potentially that part-time status sort of like might make it seem much harder to sort of like to maintain that focus. Yeah. But all the time that sort of like you're interacting with people who are doing something similar, all the time you're talking about your work, you're thinking about it, you're coming up with new ideas for it. And I think that for me was sort of like really what kept it going.
Mine was 7 years part-time, and I'm really pleased I did it part-time. And I do encourage students, if they've got the time, if they can do it part-time, I think it's a worthwhile route.
Great, thank you. We have a question. Justin Burns asks, as a PhD candidate in year 5 of 6, these insights into the articulation of research are very useful. How did you arrive at your chosen method of presenting your research? Did you explore different platforms to share your findings? Did you evaluate the methods pre-Viva? So I guess that one is about presenting, method of presenting your research. How did you decide that?
I think for all of us, I think Kate in particular was leaned towards practice-based. I think Gill's was kind of halfway between practice-led, practice-based, however we articulate that. Mine was very much practice-led, but I think I really like that idea that we become writers, researchers, thinkers, and makers, and there's no kind of when we find our own balance between those things. That actually, as visual communicators, as designers, it's something that we do in the day job. How best to present this material and convince people of my argument, and I think that to me is is something you'll lean naturally toward.
Great. So Cam asks, could you please elaborate a little the process of scoping the field in which your research sits when it's outside of design? So scoping the field in which your research sits when it's outside of design. That's or maybe a hard question. I guess is that about beginning to theorize your
It's so hard because it's so endlessly curious, just reading academic papers and texts and learning. I think it's about learning the value of being able to skim read, about looking at abstracts, about understanding what's relevant. And I found with the cartography part of it, I ended up with a sort of like a cartography reader. And where I went with it was I said, okay, which one of these do I actually find easiest to read? Which one actually connects with me as I'm reading it? And that then became the sort of like the trajectory that I went on. If the stuff that you're reading doesn't connect with you, you can probably sort of like skim it and just look at the end parts of it and then say, right, okay, I can leave that and I may refer to it, but look at everything, but decide actually sort of like what it is that connects with the type of research that you're doing and how you're understanding it.
I think you'll find that whatever you choose, it's got touch points with so many different fields. That you can take it. We could all take the same subject and then pursue different avenues with that same subject, much like designers. It's creative practice. So I think you will find the touch points by looking and scoping around and be prepared to be open-minded, as we've all said, that you will come across connections that you didn't expect to be there.
Okay, great. Thank you both. Louise Reddy in Dublin asks, was the process of getting the supervisory team difficult? And was that process led by you or one of the supervisory team? Or how does that work? So
shall I go for that one first?
Jill, yeah,
just my supervisor sitting there. In some ways, I'm probably not the person to answer this because I kind of looked into my supervisory team because Russ said, yeah, I think you should do a PhD and I'll be your director of studies. I thought, great. So I already knew Russ. And he suggested actually two of the supervisors, one of whom, Paul McNeil, had taught me on the MA. So I knew Paul a little bit. And then Ian as well came in, who I didn't know, but turned out to be fantastic. So I actually had very little input. It's only when we were discussing about getting scientists involved that I started looking around for that possibility. But in the end, we didn't go with that. But I know that other people, weren't. It wasn't that straightforward, and they maybe had to hunt around a bit and try and start suggesting people to be supervisors. So if you know, I think it helps if you know, or previously, one person who can help you. Maybe put together a team. I don't know, Russ, how would you advise people to do that?
I think
if they know you,
I'm currently managing the November round of applications for LCC. It's not all in design. And we would normally have each year about 10 or 12 applications in November. We had 35 this year. The problem being that your supervisory team have to be qualified. So your supervisory team as a pair or as 3 people have to have taken 2 people through that journey already. It's a game of snakes and ladders, mixing my metaphors again. So they have to have already taught people to completion of a PhD to be qualified to teach a PhD, which, if you can believe that. So you get an experienced supervisor, and then a junior supervisor can join them who hasn't got completions, and then it takes a number of years for them to get a completion. So it took about 10 years for me to get 2 completions. So I can work with anyone as a co-supervisor. But then the supervisors have a capacity. So supervisors, we're encouraged not to take more than 6 students each. So if a supervisor is very experienced and they've got 6 students already, then they don't have capacity to take new students, and it can take a number of years for them to get rid of their student, like Gill, and say goodbye, and then open up a space for a new student. So it's a kind of a really tricky game for us to manage in terms of, okay, what's our capacity, who's got experience, which new supervisors can come onto teams, how do we fit students to teams? So it can be based on choice. Yes, this is the ideal person, this is the perfect professor that I want to work with, but you may well find that they haven't got capacity to be able to take you. And it might have to go to someone else, and be prepared to be flexible on that. Because, and I think we, as institutions, I think it's part of our remit, our professional remit, to try and offer correct guidance and quality in terms of the allocation of supervisors.
Which is kind of why we need more people to do PhDs, in order to actually broaden that range of different types of supervisors that are out there and available. In
graphic design in particular, when I did my PhD, graphic design PhDs were really rare 20 years ago, and they're still pretty rare. So finding supervisors who are embedded within graphic design and typography is quite difficult in the first place.
Oh, Brenda, you're muted.
Somebody had to do it. Caroline Powley in New Zealand. How focused or clear does the research question need to be in a PhD application? Do you need to be able to identify your contribution to knowledge from the start? I've been asked to and found it tough, as I haven't done the research yet. Good point.
Yes, absolutely. That is a problem. It's something I kind of hinted at in the slideshow that I gave. Yes, you identifying a contribution to knowledge, it won't happen until some way through the research. It won't happen until it's something that you do typically at a confirmation. For us, from my institution, we do a confirmation meeting halfway through the PhD, and at that point we'd expect a student to identify where the contribution to knowledge is going to be. So it's about sort of a year and a half into a full-time or 3 years into a part-time PhD. So it doesn't have to be done, but you need to start with a hunch. Where do I think there's interesting stuff to be found?
Yeah, and I think, Gill, did you make that point that you kind of found yourself back, or was it Kate, where you had the question, or you're on mute now?
Now as well, great. I mean, I did start with an incredibly vague and open question, and I'm amazed kind of I got away with it, to be honest, thinking back. But at that point, I knew I wanted to look at scientific, what I called then scientific graphic design, so scientific figures, but I didn't really know what aspect of them. I was more interested in the historical development of the scientific visual languages and getting to understand how they came about, that kind of thing. So looking more to theoretical PhD. I wasn't thinking of how I could use that then in practice. So what I wrote in my application, I mean, looking back at it now, I think about 2/3 of it could just throw out. I just didn't do, it just didn't come to pass. You make all these plans in your application and say, yes, I'll do this and this and this by this stage and this stage, but it never works out like that. I don't think you end up going off in a different direction, or something else comes up. Like everyone has said, keep an open mind, and your research changes. So yes, you have to put all this together, but don't assume that you're going to be held, your feet aren't going to be held to the fire in 2 years' time. Say, oh, but in your application, you said you'd be doing this, because, that won't be the case. As long as you can show the progression that you're making from that application forwards, and maybe going down different avenues, I think that's the point, and that you can back up what you're doing with, by your research, then that's more important, I think, than having a really firm, question at the start that you then stick with through thick and thin. It just, no, it just doesn't work like that in anyone's PhD that I knew. I think everyone
although strangely, mine is completely the opposite. I didn't dare look at my proposal until I'd actually finished the PhD, because I didn't want to know that I hadn't actually sort of like met up with the proposal. I looked back at the proposal after I'd written it up and after I'd submitted, And I found out that I'd actually done everything that I said I was going to do. and I honestly, I had not been brave enough up until that point to actually look at it. But I think that was really down to Chris, who helped actually frame it with me, to make it to put it in a way that enabled me to be able to do that without tying me down to specifics of exactly what I was going to do. It was more about why I was going to do it, how I was going to approach it, and what it might result in. And that was the beauty of that research proposal.
The research proposal is a plan of action, isn't it? It's, you know, it's not the action itself.
Yeah.
So it's the plan saying you've got a fairly good handle on, there's a field that you'll want to engage with, and there's a journey you want to go on, and there's a way that you're going to undertake that journey.
Thank you. We have two questions in from Lisa Zimmerman, who's a design lecturer in Griffith College in Dublin. She has a question about funding and a question that I think is linked to a slight imposter syndrome. So she asks, how can funding be organised alternatively to traditional grants or schemes? For example, my area is sustainable graphic design. Should or can I look into funding options from elsewhere other than just art and design grants? And where do I start with that? It's quite a specific question. I don't know if you'll be able to.
Depends on the institution. If you're working in an institution, obviously in a college, sometimes the college would sponsor you in education. So the college will sponsor you as they did for Kate and for Gill. There are a fairly new set of awards called collaborative doctoral awards that are worth looking at. Which are collaborations between external agencies, so non-educational, non-institutions, libraries, archives, museums, for instance, and universities, where the student gets an award to do research that would be of benefit to that external agency. So they might be mapping an archive where the archivists don't have the time or the resources to do that, so the student can go in and do that as their PhD. So there are that's worth having a look at if that might touch on a related field.
Great, thank you. And then Lisa's second question is, she says, I have more experience in research than in actual practice. My research from 3 masters is based on industry practice. How can I overcome feeling like a cheat talking and writing about the design industry when really I'm not part of it, as I'm, inverted commas, just a researcher educator? So I think I'm not exactly sure. I don't know how quite to we might answer that question. How can you overcome feeling? Maybe it's feeling not maybe equipped to write about the design industry when you're speaking from outside it. Is that it?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what she's asking. I think it's something that we all experience at different levels. I don't work. I ran with Ian Noble, my former collaborator and partner in crime for many years, the world's least successful graphic design business. We were great at making, I think, really interesting, good-looking stuff, and we lost money hand over fist because we would throw our own fee into it and say, oh, well, we can get better print if we waive the fee. And I still work for free for most of the things that I do because I get a salary from work. So I don't consider myself a professional designer, but I do think in general, the design profession and designers within the profession have been pretty welcoming, to me as an academic and a historian or a design theorist and a design maker. I think they've been pretty welcoming in the main. I think is that the same for? I'm sure it is for you, Gill. Is that the same for you, Kate?
Yeah, I mean, largely, and I don't think you have to feel that you not being a part of something doesn't entitle you to be able to actually talk about it, because sometimes actually being outside it gives you a completely different analytical capacity to be able to understand what it is that you're looking at. You've got an overview that you don't get from necessarily being inside it. I'm still seeking my tribe. I don't feel like I fit into any one of them, and it's been quite nice playing those off against each other. With the smelly people, I'm the designer, and with the designers, I'm the smelly person, and it means that I'm never actually accountable to anybody, and I quite enjoy that. I enjoy that tension that comes from not being a part of somewhere. So I'd actually view it as being an asset rather than being sort of like a cheat.
Right.
I think I'll probably echo what Kate says, because I'm also sort of in between people, being that I've never worked as a commercial graphic designer. I still probably regard myself as a scientist deep down. So when I'm with graphic designers, I'm basically the scientist. And then when I'm with the scientists, I'm the graphic designer. And it's quite a nice position to be in. And I feel welcome in both worlds, I think, really. I think the scientists get my research more than graphic designers do, but that's maybe because it's more about the science than the good-looking graphic design. But
the only thing that sometimes grates with me is when there's a presumption that because I work in academia, that therefore I use convoluted, highfalutin academic language and I'm indecipherable to the design industry. And that somehow that they won't read my writing because it's going to be really difficult and it's going to be really academic. I've had books reviewed that said, oh well, yes, it's an academic writer, before they even read the book. And the book's set in my feeling, very plain English, because that's the way I try to communicate. But before they even read it, they make a presumption that somehow it's going to be heavy theory when it isn't.
Great. I have two questions. I think these might be the last ones who have come in from Mali Carden. I don't have a location. They say, what other projects were your peers working on? It's often difficult to gauge what sort of PhD projects are out there, as they're not shouted about as often as, say, flashy branding projects. And what's a piece of advice you would give yourself before you started your PhD? I guess retrospectively, what piece of advice would you give yourself if you were starting again? So who would like to go first on those? How do you find out what everybody else is working on? Are there places you can go to find out what PhDs are currently being pursued?
Yes, there are. There's library searches. There's papers that are constantly being published that you can go through academic libraries and find out sort of current work and recent theses. You can approach the universities, colleges, and talk to the research staff there. I could give examples of PhDs that I'm supervising at the moment, or that I'm interviewing. So I'm supervising one who's looking at aging and goth women and using photography as a practice to investigate that. I've got one who's looking at aging and acid house subculture from the mid-80s. I've got one who's looking at the Arabic protest graphics from post-First World War to the Arab Spring as a kind of history and analysis of protest graphics in the Arab world. One who's looking at university branding, and a couple I'm just interviewed that I've offered places to. One that's looking at skateboard graphics and the history of skateboard graphics and illustration, and another that I'm joining a team that's outside my remit, that's looking at European horror films 1920 to 1976 and the depiction of witchcraft. So
it's quite a spread. Well, maybe a nice way to end would be for each of you, what's the piece of advice you would give yourself before, retrospectively, what one piece of advice would you give yourself before you started your PhD, if you could do it if you had a do-over?
Or just do it again.
There's from a woman who loves a dyed-in-the-wool researcher, Kate Mclean. Do it again.
I think I would have more confidence in my ability as a practitioner, as a practice, because I really went in thinking, I just won't be able to do that at all. And it turned out that was one of the stronger parts of my PhD. So as designers, I think, as I say, don't underestimate the power of your practice. And that's an extra weapon that you have in you as a researcher that you really should use at every opportunity. I would say it really helped me.
I think that's a really good point. I'll probably add the idea about community, that the contribution to knowledge to a collective body of knowledge. It's not a solo pursuit. You're joining with a wider world, and you're contributing to that wider world. I think that's really important to know from the outset.
Yeah, and I think accepting the fact that sort of that imposter syndrome is completely normal, and you go through phases. You start off completely on a high because you've got in and you've started, and then you realize that you don't understand half of what anybody's saying, and then you sort of like get through to year 2 and you actually realize that what everybody else is saying doesn't really matter, because it's actually what you're saying that's important. But learning to actually listen to other people is also a part of that process. So it is a series. It is definitely a sort of like a traditional roller coaster of a ride.
Yeah.
But that is actually the beauty of it. And knowing that if you see in the institution that people actually come out of it with PhDs, if you've started it, there's every likelihood that you'll actually come out with one at the end as well, whatever stage you get to.
Mm-hmm.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Russ Bestley, Gill Brown, Kate Mclean, for your generosity and your frankness, and for the brilliant work, and for giving up your time to be here this evening. It's been so interesting. Just so everybody knows, this is going to be available to watch back, and we will post the link on our website and all our social media. And thank you everybody who sent in questions in advance. I hope we got to cover what everybody wanted to know. And thank you to everybody who contributed questions here on the night. And thanks again to all the ISTD team pedaling furiously in the background. And we look forward maybe to doing another one of these sessions in the new year. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
It's been a pleasure.